And so you have already seen a food web, and you know that you have all these interactions. And now you can ask, what's community ecology? Community ecology is the study of these interactions. And so we will talk about multi-trophic interactions and look at top-down and bottom-up effects. We will look at this, what you've seen in the quantitative food web, that some species can be more important than other species. And so we will discuss what is a keystone species. We will discuss a little bit on the subject of stability, because this morning I've told you that richer communities can be more stable, but I have not told you how you can achieve stability. And finally, we will talk about something which is called the ecology of fear, which I'm not going to explain right now. So, species in a community, they interact. And when you're at the same trophic level, generally it means that you compete, because you use the same resources, and then if you don't, maybe you don't interact at all, but when you interact, then it's about the common use of that resource, and that's called competition. And in this case, it's called interspecific competition. But then you can have also interactions between trophic levels. We talked already about that. So you have herbivores eating plants, or predation, predators eating the herbivores, or predators eating other predators. And we have seen that species are connected in a food web, which could be rather simple or rather complicated. And we start with a very simple food web. Here in Nepal, you have an overwhelming biodiversity. But when you go north, you go to the Arctic, the number of species goes down. We could discuss why that happens, but it's not the idea to do that now. But so you have to accept that that's the case. And so we have predators there and herbivores, and here you see a predator, a lynx, just in the act of catching its prey, which is a snowshoe hare. And this is an interaction which will result in the death of the snowshoe hare. And we will come back to this, because this is a very famous example on which a lot of ecological theory is based. And we have to analyze it in detail, so that's what we're going to do. But first, we have to talk also about not only the qualitative interactions, who interacts with whom, but also how it affects the numbers of animals. And that discipline is called population dynamics. And if you go in the scientific literature, then you can find, well, maybe 1 million papers on population dynamics. It's a discipline which is advanced mathematically very far, and it has it's been used also now for evolutionary studies, and then it's called evolutionary dynamics, and it's all based on rather advanced mathematics, and so I'm not going to bother you with that today. But classical things to study with in population dynamics are the interactions between predators and prey, or between herbivores and plants. And then we want to understand what determines the number of herbivores and what determines the number of predators. And we ask ourselves, because a lot of people, they think that there is something like a holy grail, which is called the biological equilibrium. And in fact, in nature, equilibrium situations are quite rare. In mathematical models, they're quite common. And one of the ways in which you can reach equilibria is by having density-dependent regulation. So we also talk briefly about that. But now, with this little introduction, I want to take you to the population dynamics of the snowshoe hares and the lynxes, and to see what happens. And the interesting thing is that biologists were not interested in this subject in the early 19th century, but at that time when North America had been colonized by people from Europe, they did a lot of hunting, and so they were shooting lynxes. And there was a company in the Hudson Bay called the Hudson Bay Company for good reasons. And all the trappers that caught lynxes, they skinned the lynxes and they sold the hides to the Hudson Company. And then the Hudson Company loaded them in a boat and sold them in Europe. And they did bookkeeping, and so we know from each year how many skins they bought from the trappers and how many they sold. And here you see a graph showing those numbers. And it's very interesting that this company obviously had to deal with a lot of variation, because some years there were hardly any hides of lynxes offered to the company, and some years there were many. And what's more interesting, they vary in a cycle. Goes up, and then it goes down, and then it goes up, and then it goes down, and these cycles, they have the same length of about 10 years. So you might ask yourself, how is that possible? Why are the lynxes not stable? Why do we have lynxes the same number every year? They get young every year, so what's the problem here? What happens? Now, the good thing is that the Hudson Company also bought the skins of snowshoe hares. So we have also the data for the snowshoe hares. And here they're together in a graph. And so what you see is that the number of skins of snowshoe hares also cycles with a 10-year period. And what you can also see is that the peaks of the snowshoe hares are slightly earlier in time than the peaks of the lynxes. And so then biologists, having these data, they start to think about where this cycle comes from. And so they made a model, the so-called Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model, which is a very simple model. And they said, let's suppose that we start with a certain number of lynxes and a certain number of hares, and that we know how many young a lynx gets every year and how many young the hares get. And so we put that all in a model, and then we run the model, and then we see, and we need a conversion factor, because we need to know how many hares a lynx should eat to produce a young for himself and to survive. And if you know all that, then you can run this model. And in this case, it's not for the hares and the lynxes, but it is an example of moose and wolves. But the result is the same. You see that the herbivore, the moose in this case, cycles with the same period as the wolf. And so these are not real mooses or real wolves. These are model animals that have some of the characters, their reproductive rate and their age and all those things. That comes from nature. But for the rest, this is a computer model. That's why it is very smooth. It does not show any irregularity. But the model shows that, because there's nothing else in the model than herbivores and predators, and what the model shows is that when the population of wolves is going down, then the population of moose is going up. And when the population of moose is going up, then the wolves also start a little bit later also to go up. And then when there are lots of wolves, then they eat a lot of these mooses, and then the number of mooses goes down. And then, because there's not enough food for the wolves go down, and then there are very few wolves, and then the moose can grow again because they're not eaten by wolves, and then there are more moose, and then the wolf can grow, etc., etc. So the idea is that these animals, they cycle because of the interaction between the predator and the prey. And that's very interesting because this picture looks very much like the picture I've shown you from the Hudson Bay Company. You see the cycles. And so it was very tempting to say, well, we have a model that describes the phenomena very well, and thus the idea was born that it is the lynx that regulates the population of hares, and that's therefore they cycle. You can describe it with the model, everybody happy. And then somebody asked, very nice to see that, but this is Charles Krebs. Charles Krebs is a Canadian, and he does a lot of research in the northern regions of Canada, and so he knows all these systems. He studies foals, he studies lemmings, and the predators, and the hares and the lynxes. And he has a lot of colleagues in Scandinavia and in Russia that are doing the same thing. And they all have, it's a typical thing for the north, they have these cycling animals. And so they wanted to know for sure that it is the predator that makes the prey population cycle and causes also the population of the predator itself to cycle. So what you have here is, because you can also run a Lotka-Volterra model without a predator, and what you get then is that the number of hares is increasing forever, and so it's the predator that stops the explosion of the prey population. The predator regulates the population of the prey. That's the classical idea. In the 60s, every biologist was taught that this was the case. When I was a student, I was taught this. And then Charles Krebs said, well, maybe it's true, but there are other explanations possible. So he listed a number of hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is that it is regulated top-down by the predator, by the lynx, as in the Lotka-Volterra model. And that was the common belief in those days. But he said, well, it's only one hypothesis, but it could also be that when there are lots of snowshoe hares in winter, that they overeat the plants, which is still there. That there are small willow trees where branches stick out of the snow, so there's not much, but when they really go for it, they could destroy these plants, and the result would be that the next year there's less food for the hares, and then more hares would starve from hunger. And so then the snowshoe hare would be regulated by the food, so by the lower trophic level. And so then it would be, if that was true, it would be regulated bottom up. It would be the food that determines the number of hares. And in that case, the lynx would be the victim of this interaction, and it could only follow those oscillations, and you would still get the oscillations in the lynx, but not because the lynx was regulating the population of the hares, but because the hares were cycling for another reason, and that the lynx therefore would be regulated by the number of hares and not the other way around. Now, and then there is a third hypothesis that maybe the lynx is not so important because there are lots of other predators that had been ignored because the Hudson Bay Company didn't sell their skins. You can imagine that the Hudson Bay Company doesn't sell skins of goshawks and owls. And so they are not visible in the data. And then, of course, what's possible is a combination of all these things, that predators, together with the food, cause these cycles. So then you need the whole food web, and that's much more difficult to analyze. And so Charles Krebs spent his whole life in trying to figure out which of these 4 hypotheses is true. And he had observed that there was an island where for some reason there were no lynxes, but the cycles were there. That's already very strange, of course. If the lynx would cause the cycle should not be present on the island. But there was the same cycle. And he could show that indeed food becomes limiting for the hares in winter, but not always. And so the final conclusion was that the hare cycle is produced by an interaction both of the predators and the lower cycle. So it's bottom up and top down. So that's always a pity. Ecology could be such a nice thing if the real world would would learn the theory and behave according to it. But nature doesn't want, for some reason. And in fact, you're not surprised when you see the food web of the snowshoe hare. You see many more species than the Hudson Bay Company sold. And it's too far away to see all the names, but the bottom line are all plants, and the middle horizontal line has a large number of herbivores, and then the rest is all different predators, of which the red ones are important. But the other ones are there, and they take a little bit of their share also. So, in the old days, when people believed that the lynx was regulating the snowshoe hare, then you could say, well, the snowshoe hare is not so important for the ecosystem, but the lynx is very important because the lynx determines the number of snowshoe hares, and if there are too many snowshoe hares, the vegetation will be destroyed, and then all the other herbivores will drop out of the system, and then you get a very poor ecosystem. So in that case, the lynx would be something that's now called a keystone species. And the concept of keystone species was developed by Robert Payne at the end of the 60s. And those are species that play a critical role in maintaining the structure of an ecological community. And so they are in fact the ones that determine the relative abundance of all the other species in the community on all trophic levels. And so if you take those out, then the ecosystem collapses, it changes totally. And this morning I've tried to convince you that biodiversity in itself is very important, and that you need a large biodiversity, you need all those species to get a larger productivity and a larger stability. And now you could say, well, that may be right, but if all communities have a keystone species, then at least you should, of course, save the keystone species, but then the other species would be less important. So what's the matter here? Well, that's true. And so keystone species may be very important, but it is by no means so that all the biological communities in the world have keystone species. And I started by saying that in the Arctic there are not so many species. It's a real poor environment. And in such environments, it's more likely that one species becomes very dominant in some way and determines what's happening. So in communities that are not so structured, you're likely to find a keystone species. So in the Arctic, there are many keystone species, although the total diversity is quite low. And in a tropical rainforest, it's much more difficult to point out who is the keystone species. There are many more species, and their impact to the whole thing is much smaller, and so you have a very different system. Now, I shall give you an example, a few examples, I hope, of, this one, of keystone species. And This is an experiment that was done by Joe Connell. He studied rocky shores in the ocean. And so he found a rocky shore where there were sea stars, which are predators, and there were mussels, and there were seaweeds, and there were different species of barnacle. And so it was not a very rich community, but at least it looked nice in a way, and there were many species. And he wanted to know what would happen if you would take out a predator. So he made enclosures, and then from some enclosures he removed the sea stars, and other enclosures he left the sea stars. And the result you see sort of schematically in this picture. If you take out the sea stars, then the mussels start to grow exponentially until they cover the whole surface, and they push all the other species out, the seaweeds and the barnacles. And so if you don't have sea stars, you have a community of one species, and if you have sea stars, you have a community of 5 species. And the reality is different. There are even more species in reality, but in this picture that's so. So yes, the sea star is a keystone predator. It changes the community when you take it out or when you place it back. So now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say that the snowshoe hare is a keystone species, because we know that lots of predators are dependent on it, and if you take away the snowshoe hare, then those predators would disappear, and that would sort of cascade through the whole community. The vegetation would change. You would have a very different community indeed. But what we had not expected is that the lynx is not a keystone species, because the lynx is not the only species that is driving this cycle. Other things, there are other predators are important, and the food of the herbivores is also important to keep everything in place. And the reason is indeed compensation by other predators and regulation by the food. That doesn't mean to say that predators cannot be keystone species. And there's another example here. This morning we very briefly visited Lake Malawi in East Africa. And now I take you a little bit to the north, to Tanzania and Kenya and Uganda. On the border of these 3 countries, there's a huge lake called Lake Victoria, and it has also an enormous diversity of fish, also more than 500 species. And in the 60s, British people that lived there and who liked fishing, instead of wondering about this enormous diversity of small fish, they said, we're missing something. We want to have more sport when we go fishing. And these fish, these cichlids, they are maybe 10 centimeters when they're large, really small fish, not very good for eating either. And so they said, what we're going to do is we're going to throw in a large predator, because then we can have fun in catching these large predators. And so they did so, and then many hundred species of cichlids went extinct, and the predator became very common. And I could tell you a lot more about that, but we don't do that today. Nowadays it's better because people have started to overfish the Nile perch. That's the big fish you see at the right side of the picture. And by overfishing the Nile perch, they have allowed a lot of the cichlids to come back. Not the species that went extinct, but at least of those that remained, they occur now again in large numbers. And I hope that people keep a high pressure on the Nile perch, so keep the system that way. So now, we first had a keystone species thrown in the lake, the Nile perch. It changed the whole ecosystem in a very bad way, causing the water to become turbid, causing a lot of invertebrate worms to live on the bottom that nobody was eating because the specialists that used to eat them were away, and causing the extinction of many species. So that is a keystone species. And now there's another keystone species, humans, because they suppress the Nile perch. Another example, which is needed here, because you can imagine that if you have large numbers of an invading species, and in fact the Nile perch was an invading species, it's a large fish, and there were large numbers of that. So you can imagine many large fish that they have a large impact on the ecosystem. So I have to tell you a different story. A keystone species can be a rare species. And the example comes from a work that I did in West Africa. The people there, their main source of starch is the cassava, or the manioc. And that's a plant that comes from South America. And it was free of insect pests until the early 80s of this century, the last century. And then all of a sudden there was a mealybug. Those are the white blobs that you see on the right side of the picture. They become extremely common, and they started to kill the cassava plants. And then 80% of the cassava harvest was lost to this insect. And the insect spread from West Africa all the way to East Africa. And so you couldn't eat cassava anymore. And the problem was that 80 million black African people were dependent on cassava because it was their staple food. And so there was a lot of famine in that time. And so then they called biologists in. I was one of them. And then we said, well, we can find a solution for this problem. What we do is we go to South America. That is the native home of the cassava. This insect is obviously a specialist on cassava, so it must also come from South America. We're going to look to find the insect, and then we look for its natural enemies, and then we take those to Africa, and then maybe we can change the problem. And so we did that. To make a long story short, took 3 years to find the mealybug in South America, because it's extremely rare there. Once we had found it, we found also the parastoid, which is even rarer. That's the little black wasp you see at the left of the picture. We brought that wasp to Africa and spread it. And then very rapidly the mealybugs disappeared, and the cassava started to grow again. And now all these people have food. And although this was a $30 million project funded by the World Bank, it is still, for every single dollar invested, giving back about $400 annually because of the success. And if you calculate now the total weight of these little black wasps of the whole of Africa, it's about 2 kilograms. So 2 kilograms of small tiny wasps make that 80 million black Africans have food every day. So if this is not a keystone species, I would not know what is a keystone species. It is a keystone species. It's a rare species, very modest. Most people have never seen it or will never see it, but it makes that the system functions. And it is indeed as if you turn a key. When it's not there, the food is destroyed. When it's there, there's food. Simple as that. So remember that keystone species need not to be very common and very large. Now then, also keystone species, they can have unexpected effects that sometimes we don't know. For instance, if you see that you have two species that compete for the same resource normally, and now you see that one species becomes common and then the other becomes rare. And then the other becomes common and the first one gets rare. So it looks like competition drives the negative correlation between the numbers of the two species. But very often we have not really studied all the links in a network. So sometimes it's the predator that's causing this. For instance, when one species A is common, it's the preferred prey of the predator, so the predator becomes then very common and starts to eat also a lot of species 2, which then goes down. So if this indirect thing, it's called indirect competition, and or apparent competition. And it's one of the examples to tell you that you need to really understand an ecosystem because you can before you can decide how to run it. Now, sometimes there's not a negative correlation between predators and their prey, but a positive. And there I have an example, which is about lemmings and geese and foxes. And so here you see this food web of the lemming, and it's as complicated as the one of the lynx and then snowshoe hare. We are going not through all the details, but I'll show you what happens. Lemmings cycle. You see that at the upper left. And the polar foxes, they cycle with the lemmings. And so you could again ask who is doing what, but we leave that question for now. But what's interesting now is that when you have peak years for the lemmings, so there are many lemmings, then because the lemmings peak before the foxes, there are not so many foxes. There are a lot of foxes, but not really top levels. And in those years, the brent geese that you see in the lower panel, they produce young. And then when the lemmings are down, the geese lay eggs, but all the young are eaten by the foxes. So it's because when there are many lemmings, the foxes are not hungry, that the geese are able to produce their young. So again, you see a very strange relation between two herbivores that do not compete in this case, but the interaction is caused by the predator. And again, this is a very simple food web. This is very obvious. We can see that because of the enormous differences in the cycles. These relations exist also in more complicated tropical and subtropical forests, but because their amplitude is much more modest, it's not so easy to find them. You have to study them. Now, a little remark about density dependence. What you see in the graph is 3 lines that go up first. And on the horizontal action is the prey density or the prey abundance. And so what you see is that, up the y-axis, you see the percentage of those prey taken. And what is important is that at a lower prey abundances, when the prey starts, you see that the more there are, then a larger percentage is eaten. So proportionally more prey are eaten when the prey population starts to grow. So that's a force that brings the population back. Only if they escape, then it peaks, and then the predators are saturated, they cannot, but they have a density-dependent effect once they are on the rising slope of the graph. So you want your ecosystem to stay in that rising slope, and then it stabilizes. So this is density dependence stabilizing a population. In this case by predators, but you can also do it with competition between the animals of one species that live in the same place. They exploit the same food. If food would be not limiting, then they would grow exponentially, so their numbers would double every season or every generation. And obviously that is not a stable situation. But now you can see the horizontal line at 1500, and that's what's called the carrying capacity. That is the amount of resource available in the environment to sustain those animals. And so what you now see is, first, the population starts to grow exponentially, But then food becomes scarcer and scarcer and scarcer, and the growth of the population then diminishes, and once they reach this upper level, then there is enormous competition between the animals, but the population growth has stopped. The population has become stable. Density-dependent regulation, that's called. And density-dependent regulation can stabilize communities. So when this morning I said large number of species results in stable communities, then that may be caused by density-dependent interactions between those species, either between trophic levels or within the same trophic level. Now, does this work in reality? If you accept that an experiment also represents some reality, here you see an experiment again with two protists, paramecium, and they eat unicellular algae, and they're in water in the laboratory, in an aquarium. And if you grow them if you grow the algae without the predators, then you see that they do exactly what this model of density dependence, the logistic curve that you saw in the previous slide, the red one, you see, they follow that curve exactly. So that's very encouraging. But now what we do is we do not grow them separately, but we put them together. And then you see the lower graph, and then what you see happening is that they both start to grow exponentially, because when the densities are very low, they're not competing for food yet, but they're eating away the food. And then what you see is that one species starts already the growth curve starts to flatten and finally to fall down, while the other one is going to the carrying capacity. And one species is driven to extinction. So interspecific competition can drive species to extinction. And now I suppose that you could get very angry with me because I'm so confusing. Because this morning I told you that the more species you put in a system, the more stable it is, and that biodiversity is good. And now I'm telling you something totally different. If you put species together, they might go extinct by interspecific competition. So how is it possible? Now we have to go back to this idea that we met this morning already, this idea of the Eltonian niche, and that species are different. And we have to talk a little bit evolution. So what sometimes happens is that, for instance, if you have an invading species, and there's no co-evolution, then the invading species may drive to action one of the local species by interspecific competition. That might happen. But what could be is that when both species are there, that they start to evolve, that they start to change their diet so that they're no longer dependent on the same resources, and so that they then, in the end, after a long time, have different diets, and then they can coexist. And the process of evolution to reach that stage is called character displacement. And the communities which are so species-rich, they have co-evolved together over hundreds of millions of years. And so you can imagine that then it's possible that you have a lot of species coexisting and not going extinct by interspecific competition. And the reason is that they occupy different niches. And so now we've gone through a whole cycle. I've started to convince you that every animal lives in a different niche, every species. And now you see you needed to understand that you can not have a lot of species in a community when they would not have a different niche. Now, are there examples of this? There are many examples, in fact, but the most classic one is with finches on the Galapagos Islands. And these finches are called Darwin's finches because Darwin was the first to bring to collect them and to bring them to Europe. And he noted that there were quite some species, and it helped him also to think of his evolution by natural selection idea, because he realized these islands are very far from South America, and that the chance that a bird from the mainland, as small as a finch, can fly such a long distance and arrive safely is very small. So he reasoned that maybe only a few individuals of a mainland species had arrived there, and that the only explanation why there are now many species was to assume that they had locally diversified in a number of species. And then a couple of evolutionary biologists, Peter and Mary Grant, they have spent the last 45, 50 years to prove that this works this way. And they discovered that there are two species, seed eaters, and they occur on different islands, sometimes together with the other species and sometimes alone. And so they studied then food selection, which sort of seeds do they eat. And you see here on the graph, you see the size of their beaks measured, but you could also read for it the size of the seeds they eat. That would give the same result. So, in fact, when they occur alone on an island, they do not differ in beak size and they do not differ in seed choice. But once they occur together on an island, you see that one species becomes a specialist on small seeds and has a small beak, and that the other one becomes specialized on large seeds and has a large beak. And then if you look at other species even, you can see that there are species which are insectivorous. There's one species that even uses the thorns of cactus to wriggle out insect larvae behind the bark of trees. So that's very nice. So you see, evolution works in a way to reduce interspecific competition. The process is called character displacement, and it makes it possible that you have more species in a community. But it takes a lot of time. And this is also one of the reasons why an invading species who has not co-evolved very often is causing havoc in a community. Now, again, I'm going to change your mind a little bit, because we have been talking about this Lotka-Volterra model, and I have shown you that it's quite reasonable, because the patterns you find in experiments, they're well described by the model, and so we assume that then competition is an important force in ecology, and it should, even if you have character displacement, still play a role in natural communities today. And now I'm going to shake you a little bit, because those models, they're brilliant, and the laboratory experiments in which they have been tested, they are okay. And there is one problem with the model and these laboratory experiments. They assume that the environment is constant, that there is no disturbance. And so now I want you to look at the left graph, and there you see that there are six species living together. And you look at their population numbers, and what you see is some are growing, and other ones you see after they peak, they go down. So this is our story of exclusion by interspecific competition. In the left graph, you see the diversity decrease because of interspecific competition. And so you see that there are 3 species on the way out. 2 species are still growing, 1 species has leveled off. And maybe if you would continue to look at it in time, it would also go down and disappear. So interspecific competition in that graph, because the environment is constant, will end with a lower diversity. And we want to explain the high diversity, and I've done that a little bit by invoking evolution, but now I'm going to do the same by invoking a little bit of disturbance. And that you see in the middle graph, you see the same as in the first graph, these species, they start to grow. You see one species is going down already, and then all of a sudden there is a disturbance. And so, after the disturbance, the numbers of all species have gone down, and then they have to start regrowing again. And it's very interesting, at the end of another disturbance, you see we still have 6 species. So a little bit of disturbance can counteract the effect of interspecific competition. And a little bit of disturbance very often occurs in all the ecosystems we know. So this is another reason why interspecific competition does not always drive the number of species in a community down. And now look at the last panel. The last panel, you see that disturbances occur very, very often. And now what you see is that if you go to the very end, you see there are 4 species left. So we've lost some species. And that's because if the disturbance is at a very high rate, then you need to be able to reproduce very quickly and to produce a lot of seeds and to have a short life. Biologists call that R-selected. So you never experience competition because the population can always grow and then there's a disturbance and then they can grow. Never you see the effect of competition. And so the selection is a very fast growth, short generation time, but there are very few species that do that. So you end up with a community containing less species than when you have intermediate disturbance. So a lot of disturbance is very bad for biodiversity. A little bit of disturbance, certainly if it happens in space asynchronously different places, is very good for biodiversity. Now I have to hurry because the time is over already. So that's what I said. Rare disturbance is good, and certainly if it occurs locally. Now we look at what happens after the disturbance. For instance, elephants remove part of the forest, then plants start to grow. First they are colonizing plants, which grow very fast, so they're annual plants, and then you get perennial, low plants, herbs, then you get bushes, then you get first fast-growing trees, but which are not very competitive, and then finally you get hardwood trees, which are very competitive. They overshadow these trees, and then you have your forest back. But if you would have a forest without disturbance, you would only have the hardwood trees, and because there is a little bit disturbance here and there are always places where the clock is set back, and so that adds different habitats and it adds more species to the community. This process is called succession. It's driven by interspecific competition, but you need the disturbance to keep the species in which can grow in earlier stages of the succession. Now, finally, the ecology of fear. We talked about keystone predators. And now, one of the main interests of us, because it's our emblem, is the tiger. And so we have discussions with people who are not biologists and say, well, what the hell, if there's some tigers left, what would happen if the tiger is not there? There's so many places where there are no tigers, don't you worry. And then we need to have an answer to that question. And now it's obvious, people have done an experiment with tigers. They've killed over 98% of all the tigers. And so now we know what happens when you take out the tiger. The world is still spinning, and there's still very rich nature left in places where there is no tiger. We don't know if it could be richer, that's another question. but it seems to be that the tiger is not, at least not at this moment, a keystone species. We would like it to be. We would like it to be a top predator that regulates all the herbivores, and if you take it out, the whole forest falls apart, so please put in the tigers back, otherwise it doesn't work. That seems not to be the case. Now, that's a pity. So we want to have another reason why tigers maybe are still needed very much. And this is very interesting. People have said, well, big carnivores are often rare, also when they're not hunted, and yet they have an enormous impact on their prey. This all started with biologist Schaller, who studied the lions in Africa, and he noticed that the populations of wildebeest and of zebras, which are the prey of lions, that they are so common in relation to the number of lions that it's impossible to regulate the number of wildebeest and zebras. They don't. But the conclusion that lions would not, or tigers would not be keystone species is too easy. And that has been shown recently by American researchers. They said these big animals, they are very important, these predators, because they change the behavior of the prey. The prey must be alerted the whole time, because there's always a chance that the predator comes out of the bush and eats you. So you spend a lot of time in looking around. That's time you cannot rest, you cannot feed. And maybe if there are places where the risk of predation is higher, you start to avoid those places, you go to other places. And so this may affect the vegetation. Simply the presence of large predators, they can make that the behavior of the herbivores changes in such a way that you can still call a big predator a keystone species, even if it doesn't regulate the prey. Now, this has been shown in the Yellowstone National Park in America, because the wolf had been hunted to extinction there. And then in the 90s, they have reintroduced the wolf. And here is a schedule that shows what has happened. What happened was that because the wolves were no longer there, the moose started to overgraze, making that there was no recruitment anymore of young trees. And then the beaver dropped out of the system, and the beaver is really an architect of wet habitats because they build dams, and so the environment became drier, and so all the wetland species disappeared, the beaver disappeared, the vegetation was different, the forest was aging because there was no recruitment, and then they reintroduced the wolf, and suddenly there was recruitment of new trees because the moose avoided certain areas where the wolves were in the beginning, and then later the whole system came slowly back in place. So the biodiversity has increased because the wolf has been reintroduced. The wolf is not regulating the populations of those animals, but it's causing, by fear, it's causing all these changes. So that's called the ecology of fear. Because over time, I'm not showing here the changes in behavior, but I go directly to the summary and the conclusions. So we've seen that the number of herbivores can be determined bottom up and top down, and sometimes by the same trophic level, and then we call it interspecific of intraspecific competition, and sometimes by combination of any of these factors. We have defined keystone species, and we know that those, when you add or remove them, they really change the biodiversity. Sometimes they are really needed. In the Nile perch example, where you had not a co-evolved system, it reduced biodiversity. In the case of the wolf, it increased biodiversity. In co-evolved systems, large predators generally increase biodiversity. You've seen that interspecific competition can drive to extinction animals if there's not every now and then a disturbance. So that mild disturbance is very useful. And you can create mild disturbances when you are managing a park. So sometimes it depends on where you are. You could argue that you need fires to set back succession or so, but you have to do it only when you understand what you're doing. And then finally, you have seen that evolutionary forces are very important. We tend, as ecologists, not to think about them. We tend to think that tigers will never change and deer will never change. But with the example of the character displacement, you can see that you need to know something about the evolution to understand why all these animals in a community that is co-evolved live in different niches and try to minimize the competition effects. So I hope it's not too confusing, because I've raked up a lot of different things. In ecology, sometimes you can do a lot of things together. So if you lost track about interspecific competition and its function, then please ask me to explain it again.
My question is regarding this ecological niche. As you can, in Chitwan National Park, we can see that in Pacific, like Micronemicrantha has created a lot of problem there. And can we consider this species as reductant species? And as we mentioned, ecological niche, that is a role that play any species in the ecosystem. So we should also consider, I think, should we also consider that in what extent that species play a role in the ecosystem, and in what that role may be actually?
Yes, indeed, it would have been possible. In fact, because we didn't know in advance which was the keystone species, we introduced 4 different species of parasitic wasps, and 3 of them did not get established. And then we started to do research, and we realized that this pest on the insect on the cassava, it's there in the dry season. Then the plants are already stressed, and then we had these very high densities. And during the high density period, the other species, they could stay. But then the wet season came with 2 effects. One effect is that the plants are no longer stressed physiologically, and so they start to grow and produce a lot of chemicals to defend themselves. And the heavy rains, they wash off these mealybugs from the plants, and the mealybug becomes really very rare. I was invited to join the project during the wet season, and we had all these meetings about what to do and how to do. And I said, can I please see the insect? And they said, well, you may try, go into that cassava field. And I did, and I spent the whole day without finding one. So they're really rare. And so what we discovered later in studying the behavior of the successful one is very interesting, that even if there's a single mealybug on a cassava plant, the cassava plant starts to produce a substance that is a volatile, so it's carried in the air. And so what the wasp does, it's recognizing this odor. So in fact, the cassava plant calls for help, and this wasp can go there. So the wasp can find a single mealybug in a huge cassava field, because it recognizes the odor of that plant, so it flies directly to that plant, and then it starts looking for the mealybug. All the other species were unable to do so. So the key to understand the system in this case is the bottleneck of the wet season. How do you survive the wet season? You need to be a very good specialist for that. And that's why the insect is so rare, because it drives the whole system during the wet season to extremely low densities. And now we know the mechanism, so now we know why it works. And in retrospect, we shouldn't have bothered about the others. And yeah, that's interesting that you need to know the details of the biology. And that's what I've said this morning, Oak. You need to know how the mechanism of things to understand what you're doing in a community.
So happy because rhinoceros, they are enjoying, rhinos, they are actually enjoying this plant very nicely. Now this time this plant is not a problematic, but earlier it was, because almost it replaced most of the plant from that particular area where it grows.
Okay.
Now this time this is not satisfactory. I know they are eating, and we did some kind of biochemical analysis, some very valuable elements are there. That's why it's nutritionally high, and I know they are enjoying nowadays.
But in fact, I described it rather statically. But what you have, of course, is an arms race between the predator and the prey. And I will come back to it. It's an asymmetric arms race, because a lion or a tiger, they're only hunting for a meal. And the deer and the antelopes, they're running for their life. So the effect is asymmetric, stronger on the herbivore. But if the herbivores move to a habitat where they think they're safe, these lions, of course, they will not stay behind, so they will follow. So what you get is a sort of a hide and seek game, and so there is an arms race going on. And so yes, and it may differ it may not always be the same during the season, depending on the rains. And of course, these animals have to juggle more things. In the dry season, they need to be close to water holes, and there's not so much food, so then they're easier to catch because they have to survive also. So there are all sorts of variations again that make that it can stay like that.